Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome on this typically Scottish summer's evening to this roundtable discussion on the future of Scotland and independence. The question mark here, of course, is pertinent. Before I say anything else, please, Michael, take a seat. Take off your wet togs. Dry them somewhere. I've got to make an announcement, a reminder that conference participants should remember to visit the publishers' exhibitions in rooms G09 and G10, which will be open tomorrow from 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. You may have seen that the chair for this event was meant to be Magnus Linklater. I am not Magnus Linklater. He's at least 10 years older than I am, and as Gore Vidal said of Anthony Burgess, is likely to remain so. My name is Alan Taylor, and I write for the Herald and the Sunday Herald and edit the Scottish Review of Books. So I don't really have any credentials to chair such a thing as this. I was once writing Alex Salmond's biography, which I gave an hour-long lecture on at the Edinburgh International Book Festival, having never written a word of it. Because a colleague who worked with me in those days at the Scotsman said that he had a great title for the book if I ever did write it, based on Alex's Highland constituency. He said I should call it Mine Banff. And I never thought the book could possibly live up to the title. We live, of course, in febrile times here in Scotland. The international delegates of the conference might like to know. Every day throws up some new and interesting story. I was at the launch earlier today, for example, of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, the highlight of which, believe it or not, is a session which involves Alex Salmond, the First Minister. He has read a book or two, I believe, and Ian McEwan. What they have in common, God only knows. Today's newspaper has typical things in it about what will happen if independence were to come to pass. Fuel bills could rise in Scotland. Could is the operative word in almost every headline hereabouts. The best one I've seen so far, and John might be able to tell us later on what the significance of this is, but here it is. The Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland claims that independence from the rest of Britain would weaken the position of Christianity in the country. These are not unusual headlines hereabouts. Anyway, we should crack on. The form is that each of our speakers, and we're waiting for one to arrive, will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion, then we'll throw it open to the floor, and then we could all go outside and get wet some more. So it's a great privilege, first of all, to introduce John Curtice, who I'm sure you all know. I hear him almost daily on the radio. He's got a job for life, as far as I can see it, trying to interpret where this vote is going to go, where it's been. Please welcome John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde.
Thank you, Alan. I'm going to address my remarks primarily to those of you who are not resident north of the border, on the presumption that those of you who are visiting Scotland might like a quick introduction to why we're having all these wonderful headlines that Alan referred to. So apologies to some of you who have heard of all of this before, but I hope that those of you who are not resident in Scotland, particularly those of you who are resident outside the UK, might find a quick tutorial on why Scotland is where it's at and where is it at and where might it be going useful. The first question, doubtless, you might be asking yourself if you're not in the UK is, so hang on, so why are they having this referendum on independence? Why is it after 300 years or so that we now have a government in Scotland that's committed to holding a referendum on leaving the United Kingdom? Presumably, you might be thinking to yourself, well, presumably something's happened along the way, and that now actually lots of people in Scotland wish the country to become independent, and therefore, as a result, they decided last year to vote for a government that indeed wishes to hold a referendum on that subject. Not necessarily so is the answer to that question, because the truth is, of course, elections are not necessarily simply decided on the basis of whatever policy positions that parties decide to take. They're also often determined, indeed this is often a much more important influence, by people's perceptions of the relative competence of the principal players. Now, as you may be aware, in Scotland, certainly since the advent of devolution, the principal players, so far as the battle for governmental office is concerned, is on the one hand the Labour Party, centre-left Social Democratic Party, which certainly since the 1960s has been the dominant party north of the border. And the opposition has come from the Scottish National Party, which has long been in favour of Scotland becoming independent. But prior to devolution, prior to the introduction of a system of proportional representation, prior to holding specifically Scottish elections, had found it relatively difficult to secure much in the way of parliamentary representation. Well, devolution, at least so far as the party is concerned, proved to be a lifeline, and it's been the principal competitor for power in a devolved Scotland ever since 1999. Well, the Labour Party, together with the Liberal Democrat coalition partners, ran Scotland's devolved government for the first 8 years. But then back in 2007, very, very narrowly lost power. The SNP had one more seat, and the SNP were able to form a minority government. Now, as a minority government, they were able to some degree to demonstrate their governing credentials, though they were, of course, reliant on other parties to remain in office. And one of those paradoxes that I won't try to explain to you is actually they were primarily kept in office by the Conservatives, who are the most unionist of all the unionist parties and who ideologically are probably, in some respects, supposedly furthest apart. But there we go, politics does tend to make strange bedfellows. And during that period, I think it's fair to say that the SNP was widely regarded as having done a reasonably good job. And that's indeed, for the most part, indeed, civil servants tend to think they've done a reasonably good job. And indeed, one crucial thing to realise here is that when the Scottish Parliament was created in 1999, the SNP effectively put their first 11, or if you prefer, first 15, into the Holyrood chamber. For them, this was the most important institution. All of their senior personnel effectively ended up in that institution. In contrast, the Labour Party, with already around 50 Westminster MPs when the Scottish Parliament was first created, with varying degrees and for a variety of reasons, discouraged many of their senior personnel from standing for the Scottish Parliament. And the truth is that, therefore, as a result, the Labour Party in Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, those benches were being occupied by Labour's second 11 rather than its first 11. And I think the truth is that by 2011, the electorate had begun to notice. And that in many respects, the SNP were regarded as having provided pretty effective government. Asked people whether or not they thought the Labour Party could do a better job. Answer was, not really. And then, just to give you a kind of a snapshot of the way in which the Labour Party's campaign went wrong, the Labour Party's big campaign theme was, well, now the Conservatives are back in power at Westminster, you need the Labour Party to defend Scotland. So what did the man who was supposedly going to defend Scotland do the moment he was accosted by a very well-known local left-wing activist on Glasgow Central Railway Station? He ran off into a Subway sandwich shop in order to escape him. That became a YouTube sensation, and that was the end of the Labour Party's campaign. So in other words, the SNP won with a quite remarkable movement in the early days of the election campaign in early April last year, and did so well, they did even better than they expected, that despite the use of a system of proportional representation, they ended up with an overall majority. But if you look at the survey evidence, were the people who were voting for the SNP necessarily voting for independence? Answer no. Only around a half or so of those people who voted for the SNP also said they're in favour of independence. And lots of people out there were saying, we're looking for the SNP because they can provide Scotland with more effective devolved government than anybody else. So that's why we are where we are. We're there not necessarily because the public were necessarily demanding a great deal, wanting independence, but rather they were looking for a party to provide them with effective devolved government, and it certainly had demonstrated an ability to defend Scotland's interests within the UK. Big irony here is, and there is some survey research to suggest this, in fact, the SNP, by being in some respects a rather awkward customer vis-à-vis its relations with the UK government, were beginning to persuade Scots that actually devolution could be made to work, because essentially what they wanted was somebody awkward in Edinburgh standing up to London, which is what the SNP were offering. Okay, so therefore you will not be surprised to hear that although we are now apparently 2 years away from holding a referendum on independence, it isn't clear that indeed Scotland is going to vote yes. Indeed, at the moment, it's perfectly clear that the odds are that Scotland will vote no. We've had, since the beginning of January this year, we've had something like 14 or 15 opinion polls, which in a variety of ways, using a variety of modes and a variety of methods, have asked people a binary question: are you for or against independence? And if you take all of those opinion polls and you take out all the don't knows and people who don't care and all the rest of it, and take the average of all of those, what you discover is that 40% of people are basically in favour of independence and 60% are against. That figure is virtually unchanged from last year. And if you look, there are 2 or 3 surveys, one of which I'm involved in, which have asked different questions, but they've kept on asking the same question consistently over a long period of time, in one case all the way back to 1999. And these surveys basically suggest that there has not been any significant long-term change in attitudes towards independence since the advent of devolution in 1999. And to that extent, at least, it looks like a remarkably stable story, and one that, therefore, to that extent, is going to be quite difficult for the nationalists to turn around. And indeed, one thing we've certainly learned, one of the things that the SNP anticipated when they first came to power in 2007 was that if they provided Scotland with effective devolved government, which for the most part people in Scotland think they have done, people would then be convinced of the merits of independence and we would be able to increase levels of support for independence. That logic has proved to be fallacious. And while the SNP being popular is probably a necessary condition for them winning a referendum, it's now perfectly clear it isn't a sufficient condition. So the truth is, at the moment, it looks as though support for independence is not sufficient to win a referendum. On the other hand, 40% is not so far away from 50% that maybe if at last some movement could be generated, the independence camp might be able to win. Which obviously raises the question, what in a sense is the debate going to focus on? On what are the things that primarily appear to determine whether or not people are for or against independence? Well, you won't be surprised, obviously, one of the things that's important, without it we wouldn't be having this debate at all, is the fact that Scotland has a distinctive sense of national identity. If you force people in Scotland to choose one single identity, then basically out of the list of kind of identities that will be found across the British Isles, about 75–80% consistently say they are Scottish, only around 15% say they are British. So this is predominantly a Scottish society. Many people in Scotland will feel some sense of Britishness, but it's undoubtedly for most people a secondary sense of identity. And to that extent, at least, this is a society which, in terms of its sense of emotional national identity, is different from the rest of the United Kingdom. Indeed, all 4 parts of the UK are different from each other. But that certainly isn't, feeling a strong sense of Scottish identity is not a sufficient condition to persuade people that they're going to vote for yes for independence. Again, you discover that even amongst those people who say they are Scottish and explicitly deny that they are British, only around a half at the moment are in favour of independence. What then also seems to be important, and what perhaps, unlike identity, might be something that might be more capable of being moved in one direction or in the other. And the answer is, surprise, surprise, is people's perceptions of the economic consequences of Scotland becoming an independent country. And in that respect, the debate in Scotland mirrors very much that in Quebec, in Canada, which again, apart from the issue of language, was about identity and economic consequences. If people are convinced that Scotland would be better off under independence, they tend to feel confident about it, and around 80% of that group are then saying they're going to vote in favour. And the fascinating thing is that the truth is that this debate has not yet been won or lost by either side. Unionists would like to believe that most people would believe that the idea of Scotland becoming an independent country is a kind of daft idea that you wouldn't even contemplate. And it's quite clear the public don't buy into that argument. But equally also, despite many years of attempted persuasion, the SNP so far have not succeeded in persuading a majority of Scots to be better off. Essentially, when you ask people what they think is going to happen, roughly a third think that Scotland's economy will be stronger, roughly a third think it will be weaker, and about a third in the middle. So you can see there's a debate that's either side. But crucially for the SNP, unless people are actually positively convinced the economy will be better, they tend not to go for independence. And they just simply think, well, it's not going to make much difference. They're inclined to want to hang on to the Union. And then just one final remark. I mean, the other thing to then appreciate about this economic debate is that the context within which this economic debate is now taking place is a very different one from what it would have been a very few years ago. And that is effectively a consequence of the Eurozone crisis, because one key central plank of the SNP's vision for an independent Scotland is that it would not have its own separate independent currency. It would, at least for the foreseeable future, want to remain part of the sterling union. So yes, what the SNP are offering Scotland is a monetary union of more than two countries, well, of two countries in this instance. And of course, as a result of the Eurozone crisis, questions are being asked about whether or not indeed it is possible to have a monetary union between two countries, and certainly for those two countries to carry on without any degree of fiscal coordination. And undoubtedly that debate, whether or not indeed the prospectus the SNP have been offering so far of independence without a separate monetary union, is undoubtedly something on which they're having to fight quite hard. On the other hand, it's also true that most unionists have now had to acknowledge that actually, well, we can argue about whether Scotland would be better off or worse off under independence. We can argue about whether or not the price of oil is going to be high enough to ensure that Scotland's revenues are or are not better than those of England's at present. But equally, it's also perfectly clear that the truth is that Scotland could survive as an independent country. It's just a question of whether it'd be better off or not. So to that extent, at least, both sides have some quite crucial arguments still to get across over the economic debate. But I think it is now an economic debate that probably is going to be even more intense, given the circumstances in which it's taking place, than it otherwise would have been. Anyway, hopefully that gives you some idea of why we're all talking about this subject and how we're talking about it. But anyway.
Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Owen Dudley Edwards, about whom much could be said. That he's an Irishman with a Welsh name living in Scotland and teaching American history, you could say, I suppose. But Owen.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a very great pleasure to be here with so distinguished an editor of the Scotsman as Magnus Linklater in the chair. As a historian, I live in the past. And one of the great advantages of living in the past is to know that the future is not your field. I've been reviewing an enormous volume on Scottish history, just been published. Tremendously valuable things in it. But on the second last page it says that it is clear that it would be virtually impossible for the Scottish National Party to obtain an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament. The unfortunate book is thus obsolete before it is published. And there have been several other recent histories of Scotland which have said very much the same sort of thing. And the answer is not to be rude about colleagues who are wrong. I've been wrong millions of times, I'm certain, in anything I've published. But stay away from the future. Now, it's particularly easy to do this tonight because we have just been hearing a splendid address from Professor John Curtice. And as I contemplate a world which becomes more and more inhuman, subhuman, and exhuman, it's particularly splendid to hear a social scientist of Professor Curtice's distinction producing his material so attractively, so constructively, and so informatively that there is still a splendid human voice to the terrifying discipline of psephology in Scotland. And may I say, we have every reason to be proud of him. It's a great delight to hear him in action on television programs. There is no sign of the contemptible cynicism and gee, how much cleverer I am than either the electorate or the politician, which you so often get from commentators on these occasions. So God bless him, and if you will take him as a symbol as to the health of universities in Scotland, we will be fortunate and we can go on to be very grateful. Now,
I'm waiting for the but.
Will somebody tell that impersonator that he would be unmasked, removed, and sent to the outer regions if there's any more interruptions from him? If, whether or not Scotland becomes independent, it may very well be that history will still feel that the greatest service the Scottish National Party has done is that it has been implacably against violence. That it is a party of nationalism which, under no circumstances, was prepared to countenance anything of the nature of violence and ruthlessly expelled people who showed any sign of that. We've every reason to be very grateful for that, and I, of course, originally coming from Ireland, I've lived in Scotland since 1966, I knew the poisoned chalice which Ireland got with its nationalism. Ireland, of course, has got various lessons to teach in this present debate. For example, the Irish and the United Kingdom lived in a monetary union for 50 years after 1922, so all that's been said about whether it's possible is nonsense. It has already been. It's history. That's unarguable. I remember when I was a child, the pound notes would appear and on the bottom was written, this note entitles the bearer to receive £1 on demand in London. That was independent Ireland. And we have to realise that there is also a great deal more misinformation being peddled around. One piece of lunacy, for example, is the notion that in the event of Scottish independence, Britain would lose her seat at the United Nations Security Council. This is completely absurd. The United Nations is the continuation of the wartime alliance under that name. Russia did not lose her seat on the Security Council when she lost large portions of her anatomy. Nor is there any reason why the United Kingdom would. Oh, but you'll be expected to have a nuclear bomb. Well, God knows we are far gone in the depravity of holding weapons with which we pledge ourselves ready to wipe out as much of the human race as we can. But it's not yet been made a credential for the Security Council. On the contrary, the high idealism is still officially and constitutionally present there. But the question of the SNP's hatred of violence is, I think, absolutely vital to us in looking at this debate as it goes ahead. One of the greatest intellectuals the SNP had, and it's just lost two great ones in Sir Neil McCormick and the man who I'm about to quote, Stephen Maxwell, said, he was speaking to me last month, that independence is the only way Scotland will get rid of nuclear bombs, nuclear weapons. These weapons of mass destruction, which we must get out of the country. We cannot continue to participate in the crime of stating our readiness under certain circumstances. If somebody does something else, to be ready to wipe out as many people as possible. And all the posturing about the evil of weapons of mass destruction held by the late dictator of Iraq turned round and speak to us while we're still holding these weapons. Scotland wants out, and it is one of the greatest possible reasons for independence. But we can also say the custody of the welfare state is one of the reasons. We can say, above all, the National Health Service is one of the reasons. To which you might say, if you know British politics fairly well, but isn't this the Labour Party legacy? Quite right. The Scottish National Party is calling for independence to preserve the best things that the Labour Party was for, brought into being, and is now deserted, tacitly leaving the Tories to do their dirty work for them, but in the hope that the dirty work will be done when the Labour Party returns to power. The SNP therefore is standing as the custody of what is best in the past of the union of Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, etc. It's of course also from a historical point of view, if you're trying to say how did this movement get going, well, it got going in the 1920s. Although there were interesting roots of it, remarkable ones. And it got going partly as a reaction to World War I, where so much had been promised and so little was produced. Still more, it was a reaction to the visible crumbling of the British Empire, in which the Scots, and indeed the Irish, had participated to their considerable individual advantage. But now this was over. And in a sense, I'm sorry to put it crudely, but the bribery of the British Empire had been there holding the Union in place. This has been brilliantly explored by Professor Tom Devine, Michael Fry, various other recent writers on the Scottish Empire. The movement was partly a literary movement, and well worth your study for that reason. The great Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid, and the great Scottish novelist Compton Mackenzie, these are but several literary figures of the movement. Indeed, in its initial stages, you could be a member of the SNP and a member of other political parties if you wanted to be. They got away from that, they became much more of a professional party, and the discovery of oil in the North Sea ended the continual argument that an independent Scotland could never survive on its own. It became a very different debate thereafter. Equally, when devolution was offered in the 1970s, it was, in a sense, nobody's friend, except the newspaper The Scotsman, which was vociferously in favour of it, but which, at the point when devolution was achieved, was sold to somebody who wanted to try and wreck the Parliament and succeeded in wrecking the Scotsman. In the 1970s debate, a narrow majority voted in favour of a Parliament for Scotland, but a parliamentary fudge prevented that being enacted. But the truth was it was a compromise. Most of the country either wanted independence or, in the much larger version, the much larger body, to continue the status quo. But after 11 years of Margaret Thatcher's government, Scotland became howling mad for devolution. And in 1997, of course, they got about well over 2/3 of the electorate voted in favour of a Scottish Parliament. From this point of view, SNP's strategy in the next couple of years consists partly in the hope that as many politicians will come up and try to make the case for union as possible, because the more the politicians from London come up, the greater the follies they will produce for the edification of the Scottish public. Mr. Cameron, for example, has been up frequently trying to say that you cannot leave the Union. We have the 4th largest defence force in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, what a defence of an institution, of a country. We can murder nearly as many people as everybody, as all the biggest powers. Not quite, but we may be the 3rd one of these days if you only stay in it. It is no rational reason for continuing. What there is, in fact, is a reason to conserve. The question was being asking, why should there be a sympathy between the Tories and the SNP? There may be little, but there is. In the older Tory party in certain ways, and in certain of its present members, a belief that there are certain Scottish institutions to be conserved. A recognition, perhaps, even if the government doesn't recognise it, of the tremendous importance of investment in education and the giving of university students free education as an investment to ensure the continuation of a high intellectual quality in the governance and maintenance of the country. So the SNP, from this point of view, therefore, cannot simply be a political party. It has to be the custodian for what was best in the past of the other parties. And from this point of view, as it goes forward, yes, there will be all sorts of ragged controversies, people will be accusing each other of all sorts of things, and the press will try not only to trivialise but to distort as much as possible. They have to do that because the Mr. Murdochs of this world who employ them expect them to do that sort of thing, and we must not be unkind about them. That little gentleman in the chair is really a very, very nice chap, despite what they've done him to write.
Don't work for him.
But the basic question is, a country exists. Oddly enough, Scotland was much more independent of the UK in general than Ireland was. For example, Irish law is the child of English law. Scottish law is totally distinctive. Scottish educational traditions were remarkably different. The Scots even managed to tie in an extra religion. Oh, and by the way, as regards that headline about the Free Church of Scotland saying that God, as it were, will be in a worse world if the SNP is independent, on Tuesday night I had the pleasure of seeing one of my former students being installed, as Professor of Systematic Theology in the Free Church College, and the presiding pastor was a vociferous and enthusiastic supporter of Scottish independence. So you certainly should not believe people who announce that they speak for free churches when it's very doubtful if they're capable of speaking for themselves. So I leave it with you there. The future may very well lie with the government in London. We have 2 years for them to make a godforsaken mess, and they're well on the way to doing that, and for the Labour opposition to show that Tweedledee is no very good bet as an alternative to Tweedledum. In those circumstances, you're quite likely to get independence. But as I say, my field is the past. It's much safer.
Thank you very much, Owen, for that. It may seem impolite that we've left the women to last, but we are operating alphabetically, if you're inclined to notice these sort of things. I think the past is going to be Catriona MacDonald of Glasgow University's subject. Catriona.
Thank you. Always avoid neat solutions like alphabetical order when you're following Owen Dudley Edwards. In his work, After Britain, Tom Nairn describes the years separating union and devolved government as a 3-year interregnum. Our discussion tonight, I think, is testament to the fact that things are not that simple. And to style them as such is, I think, to underestimate the sheer ambition and success of the union project, and similarly to overestimate what devolution in and of itself can actually achieve. If the post-union years are an interregnum between states of independence, we are still living in that time, and its duration and resolution remain a matter of conjecture. At present, claiming the phrase of the Edinburgh poet Ron Butlin, past and future are contrapuntally combined. So in addressing whether, how and when Scottish independence is to be secured, this piece follows a long-standing precedent in these matters, being a work not of research, but in the main at least, of inference. And that quote comes from Dicey and Reid. It's, as Owen suggested, very unsettling territory for a historian. So, what then might or ought to convince Scots that independence should be seized and the union broken, or at least renegotiated? Well, the claims of the past, this is an audience of historians, certainly cast long shadows in this debate, but it's clear that demands for independence in the 21st century cannot simply adopt the rhetoric of 1320 or 1638. Instead, quite simply, Scots will have to be convinced that in the future things will be better under independence than they are now. What things, and when, and in what ways better is the stuff of argument. Now here there is forewarning in the devolution settlement. It might be argued that the settled will of the Scottish people at the end of the 20th century was not in favour of devolution per se. What it was in favour of was constitutional change that cost Scotland relatively little, but was a means of securing Scottish solutions to Scottish problems. It was not so much that Scots wanted vastly different things for their people, but there was a certain matter of emphasis, a certain set of priorities that could be marked out territorially. And it's that territorialisation of British politics here that I think is very important. From all this, then, the most obvious conclusion to be derived is that support for independence will rise if, as and when, it is appreciated that despite the costs, and these have yet to be established, devolved government within the Union no longer promises the best means of ensuring Scottish solutions for Scottish problems that matter most at the time. Quite simply, there are very few absolutes in all of this, and that's important. So, Given that we can't see into the future, conjecture is at a premium. And here we are in Edinburgh, you know, who gave us men like Dugald Stewart, who could have taught us about conjectural history. But despite rumours to the contrary, we've yet to reach the end of history, and predictions are fraught with danger. Politicians and academics have been caught out. 5 years before devolution was secured, Paul Scott found it, quote, improbable that a British government would deliver Scottish devolution. And an author who Owen didn't reveal, so I'm not going to reveal him either, predicted in 2009 that it is unlikely that a single party will ever gain a majority in the Scottish Parliament. Of course, 2 years later, the SNP recorded a remarkable victory at the Holyrood elections. So, for me, what this seems to point to is that when it comes to debates about independence, the one thing that can be studied with any degree of confidence is less the likelihood of a certain outcome than the types of argument that will most likely influence the will to change, no matter what shape change takes. But what will it take? Well, Scots may be loath to admit it, but it's likely that circumstance will ultimately shape our constitutional future more than principle. After all, we've been debating the principle of independence for centuries, and we've done precious little about it. First, the opportunities, as we've heard, inherent in the empire, and then the reassurances of the welfare state encouraged an acceptance of the deal done in 1707. Nevertheless, subtle changes in our approach to independence are evident. Having already survived 5 years of an SNP administration, we have more cause to believe that independence will not threaten what we value to any greater extent than maintaining the Union has done to date. In 2012, you do not have to be a Bruce or a Wallace to suggest that we may be better off alone. Indeed, quite the contrary. To borrow a phrase from Colin Kidd, the banal unionism of the last 300 years is more likely to be extinguished by a similarly banal sense of self-interest than a patriotic call to arms. But all this contingency has limits. One would like to think, and here I do appeal to the past, that a country that sunk at least a quarter of its floating capital in the swamps of Panama in 1698, and then brokered a union that within a year had killed off the Scottish Privy Council, might, this time round, be cautious about buying a pig in a poke. Now, again, there is precedent here. It is unlikely that the vote in favour of devolution in 1997 would have been as convincing had it not been for the fact that the Constitutional Convention had gone some way down the road of developing what in practical politics the principle of devolution actually meant in real terms. And if further proof is required, this can of course be contrasted with the referendum of 79, when a public and civic consensus on the practical implications of devolution was not galvanised in advance of the vote. So, whether the route to independence involves one, two, or multiple referenda is really missing the point. And I would suggest nationalists do their cause no good whatsoever by being so prickly about the matter. If that's not accepted, or if the debate on the meaning of independence continues, as it has done so far, with insufficient real flesh on the barren bones of vague principle, then the reign of banal unionism may have some way to go. It's fair to say that the resolution of these various contingencies will be found in circumstance, and that's not to say very much. It's just a definite maybe if asked whether independence will be realised. But circumstance is shaped by interest groups, by their priorities, by their relative weight, the relative weight they carry in decision making. Put simply, one thing we can say for sure is that in any new constitutional arrangement there will be winners and losers, and identifying at least some of these and anticipating their power brokerage is possible even at this distance. Now, over the years, Scottish nationalists, nay, Scots in general, have taken heart in the fact that the model of nationalism advocated by the majority interest in Scotland has been rooted in this country's civic culture. Thus, we are told we avoid the taint of racism, ethnocentrism, and the worst excesses of mid-19th century romanticism. That having been said, of course, men like the economist Sir Alec Cairncross admitted, this time in poetry, and I quote, that this is the home of ancient persecution, ungovernable wills, the spirit of denial, fanaticism. Whatever the truth of it, we've been apt to reassure ourselves that in contrast to a range of more sinister alternatives, civic nationalism is inclusive, it is respectable, it is civilised, it is a good thing. As far as it goes, this is very well, but it goes nowhere near far enough. In particular, two complicating factors which have consequences for the independence debate are neglected when we languish in this reassuring balm of wha's like us. First, the identification of civic nationalism as a straightforwardly good thing avoids the reality that instead of being more inclusive, civic nationalism is perhaps simply as exclusive as other renderings of nationalism, just differently so. It goes without saying that any definition of citizenship will define itself as much against what is not part of the established civic sense as what elements it. In turn, this means, in Scottish terms, that certain behaviours, certain groups, certain individuals will find themselves either on the periphery of what constitutes good citizenship or excluded altogether. Adopting a civic form of nationalism does not avoid the challenge of defining who the nation is and what the nation ought to be. It's more than simply conjecture, I would suggest, to suggest that a significant proportion of Scots may feel as excluded from the body politic should civic nationalism direct the ship of state as those already at a loss as to how they relate to unionism. And secondly and finally, nationalism's commitment to its civic manifestation may have paradoxical consequences. Arguably, civic nationalism offers the nationalists their strongest case for independence at present. But in practical terms, it may also place that cause in jeopardy. More so than other forms of nationalism, civic nationalism has meaning only insofar as it is expressed by individuals and interest groups. So it's in many ways commendably less abstract than other forms of nationalism. But because the mobilisation of human capital is a necessary precondition of its being, it's perhaps more vulnerable to the whims, the fads, and the self-interest of groups over whom nationalisms and political parties have little control. Now, the devolutionary process taught us how powerful such interest groups can be. The Scottish legal establishment, Scottish business interests, Scottish charities, the Scottish press, indeed, and many more, all played a part in galvanising support for, or simply not creating obstacles to, devolution in the latter decades of the 20th century. But that doesn't mean that a precedent has been set for the future, particularly because after a decade and more of devolved government, most of these interest groups have been reassured that devolution has not threatened their interests, and indeed many of them have reaped rich rewards. Scott Greer has reflected that the costs and the benefits of secession ultimately are not so important as who bears them. So the question to be asked in this context then is, what will it take for civic Scotland to appreciate that its often contradictory interests will most likely be best secured by independence? Underlying this, of course, is the stark realisation that independence may not be achieved solely or indeed mainly as the outcome of grand constitutional principles. Rather, it may be the outcome of machinations and calculated risks similar to those of 1707 and amongst groups oft-times as unrepresentative of Scottish popular opinion as the frock coats on the Royal Mile were in 1707. As ever, promise will be measured against risk. And the experience of such matters in the past suggests that cautious conservatism will be the most popular response of civic groups to change of such magnitude. Remember, it took 178 years after Union for the Scottish office to be established, and a further 114 years for devolved administration to be held accountable to an elected Scottish Assembly. Experience would suggest that if we are waiting pardon me, on Scottish lawyers, for example, to effect a constitutional earthquake, we may be waiting some time. Thank you.
And finally, Joyce McMillan has joined us. She is a columnist and drama critic for the Scotsman newspaper.
In a sense, I would agree with a lot of what the speakers who have spoken already have said, and particularly with what I heard John Curtice saying as I came in, unfortunately late because of the gridlock in the north side of Edinburgh, about the pragmatic and very sort of nuanced nature of the decision that the Scottish people now face. I was recently appearing at a debate about these related subjects at the Wigtown Book Festival, and an Irish person leapt to their feet and said, "I can't understand this at all, you know, where's your passion? This is about your freedom as a nation, you know, why aren't you all, you know, shouting Braveheart, freedom and demanding your rights and all the rest of it? Why is it not a more emotional debate?" And of course you will find, in fact, I think it's a statistically defined minority of 10 or 12 or 15% or something of the Scottish people who do feel very strongly and emotionally about it and think that come what may, a free Scotland would be a better place than a Scotland which is in the United Kingdom. But it's simply a fact of the nature of the Union and the history of the Union between Scotland and England that it is not like that, most Scots have traditionally quite lightly worn their double identity as both Scottish and British. They don't have any great emotional difficulty with that. Perhaps that's to do with the religious history of the Union, perhaps it's to do with its political history, perhaps it's to do with the fact that it was a parcel of rogues and a political decision rather than an invasion and a conquest. But whatever the reasons for that relatively easy acceptance of a double identity, it has been a characteristic of Scottish society for the last 300 years. And even Scots who confidently proclaim themselves to be much more Scottish than British, which is quite common nowadays, will nonetheless slightly resist being told that they're not British at all. On the contrary, they like to feel that they have these layers of identity, and many of them also feel very happy being defined as in some way European, and indeed citizens of the world in the best cases, which is always a good thing. So multiple identities are us here in Scotland, and of course in the early phase of this move towards greater Scottish self-government, that was a tremendous strength because we were capable of grasping this idea that you could have a fairly strong form of devolution within the Union without breaking the Union. And at the time when the whole of the Union, apart from those who were in Conservative government in the 1980s and early 90s, were discussing constitutional reform, that was a very strong position to be in, a position which was in favour of greater pluralism, both in geographical terms and in terms of other reforms, possible reforms of the British Constitution. So it's a very nuanced relationship, and at the deepest cultural level, even the SNP, of course, now willingly concede that the social union between Scotland and England is a particularly close one. For the vast majority of Scots, it has no real linguistic dimension. There's no tension of that kind. A lot of the social bonds are extremely close, family bonds, economic bonds, all the rest of it. And whatever happens in constitutional terms, that social union will not be broken. Therefore, we are talking about a judgment call about which constitutional arrangements offer the best future for the Scottish people. And as already been said, the definitions of best are among the most interesting things about this discussion. There is partly a hope that an independent Scotland could possibly be more prosperous and more fair. But there's also a hope that in the mere act of becoming independent, Scotland in the 21st century sense of the word could maybe help to redefine political authority in a way that seems increasingly pressing given the condition of things at the beginning of the 21st century. Because the other thing that makes this a very subtle and nuanced debate now, of course, is the fact that national sovereignty itself is now increasingly, in the case of many small nations, looking like a bit of a dead letter. I mean, you really do have to ask yourself, after all the struggles of those two nations, how much national sovereignty the people of Greece and Ireland really have today, when they are effectively being, what do they call it, blackmailed into accepting, exceptionally severe and bullying austerity measures laid down not in their own parliaments, not in their own governments, but somewhere else as a condition of remaining part of the European currency union. And of course, Scotland, I think, would typically, if it was an independent country, have a very internationalist approach. It would want, in principle, as the SNP said until very recently, to join something like the euro. But you have to consider, under 21st century conditions, just how much national independence really means under those circumstances. You can talk about sovereignty, but in terms of the day-to-day life of citizens, it may mean very, very little if you don't have the economic power to actually determine your own policy over things as vital as old age pensions, free university education, and many of the other things that are now being taken away from the people of southern Europe. And it's also possible to argue, I think, that some of the more prosperous German Länder now are probably in a stronger position to determine their own futures in terms of some of those vital domestic policies, independently, that is, of the central German government, than some of those smaller nations, smaller supposedly sovereign nations within the European Union are, simply because of their economic weakness. So in those two ways, this has become actually a very complex debate, and one that in some ways puts Scotland on the cusp of a very powerful and significant debate about the whole question of political authority in the early 21st century. You know, we are absolutely used now to seeing huge governments like the British government, running scared of the so-called bond markets, whoever they are. Seem to be a bunch of reactionary kids somewhere who can't even predict that Lehman Brothers is about to go bust, but nonetheless, we are all to run scared of them and deliver to them the domestic policies which they like. So we are living in very strange times for the whole concept of national sovereignty. And that makes the decision faced by the Scottish people one which you either take in a kind of fantasy world, where independence, is still the thing that it was, 500 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 100 years ago, or you understand that what you're taking is actually a very marginal and nuanced practical decision about what possible constitutional arrangements might help you to have a better future. And I think one of the consequences of that situation, I mean, there are myriad consequences, but there's just one big consequence, which I would like to just highlight quickly, is that I think actually both sides in the Scottish independence debate, in terms of the political parties ranged for and against the Union, are actually now showing some really serious underlying weaknesses, which mean that the Scottish people are not going to be faced with a very convincing or a very well articulated choice. I think the SNP, as a party whose current main leadership were formed during the period of rapid economic growth and kind of sort of energised development of the European Union in the 1980s and early 1990s, are not moving very quickly to adapt to the new situation in which they find themselves now, when we're in the midst of a global economic crisis and the future of the Eurozone is very much in question. They're not adapting well to that. They have, of course, shifted to this position that we would keep sterling, but already the Union camp are, poking and nudging at the kind of holes in that argument and saying, well, if you want to keep sterling, wouldn't it be better to stay in the UK, and then you might at least have some political control over it. So the SNP is not moving in a very nifty sort of way to adapt to the times that it's in. It's not bad, it could be worse, but it often looks, when you look at its leadership and their conduct, as if it's a bit stuck in the 1990s. It has a kind of Blairite look. They all wear these suits and they all think it's okay to be hanging around schmoozing Rupert Murdoch and taking big donations from dodgy millionaires with right-wing views about homosexuality eventuality. And they don't seem to me to have grasped the extent of the crisis into which that economic system and that way of doing politics with that economic system is moving, or at least the leadership haven't. Alex Salmond doesn't seem to have. And it seems to me that unless they move pretty fast to develop a more convincing model of what an effective 21st century state would look like, and I don't see why they haven't got the resources to do that, frankly. I mean, look where they are, you know, here in the home of the Enlightenment, lots of brainy people interested in their cause, lots of universities, lots of intellectual resources all around them. So where is the joined up thinking about how you reconstruct a really effective state for the 21st century and how a new independent Scotland could become a model for that? Have they done that thinking? I don't think so. Are they putting that in front of the Scottish people? I don't think so. And they're missing an absolutely colossal opportunity, not only for us here in Scotland, but for the whole debate about the future of political authority in the 21st century, in my opinion. And I think the Scottish people are becoming rightly sceptical that what they're looking at in the SNP is just another bunch of politicians who, when push comes to shove, would rather do a trade deal with China than meet the Dalai Lama, which is today's topic of debate. And of course, that is not even a sensible practical decision at this phase of politics. You know, people say, oh yes, you've got to be realistic and schmooze the Chinese government and not meet the Dalai Lama. But it is not realistic to sicken your entire population with your moral cowardice and so on. So, you know, it's actually practically disempowering if you don't show at least a little idealism in situations where it's definitely useful to do so, apart from right and proper. On the unionist side, mind you, the weaknesses are even more spectacular. The negativity of the unionist position in this debate about Scottish independence is truly shocking. I've been to one or two seminars where very senior people, including Alistair Darling, who's now the kind of de facto leader of the unionist campaign, have been speaking and have begged them to make a positive case for the future of the United Kingdom, and they are unable to do it. Their only ability at the moment is to say, oh, this will be very difficult, and that will be awful if you don't have your nuclear weapons, and you'll never be allowed to stay in the sterling as a currency, or you'll never be able to do a deal to have any influence over sterling. If you know, all of the kind of no's, negatives, nots, this would be awful, that would be dire, you know, just totally politics of fear. And as has already been said tonight, it is an observable truth about this union, to which the Scots have always taken a rather practical, pragmatic, and not to say self-interested attitude, is that they have always, Scotland has always been happier with the union when it has looked like a progressive project of some kind, with a future, an idea of itself, and something to aspire to. At first, that was largely the huge, colossal opportunities that came with the British Empire. Later, as Owen's already said, it was the genuinely idealistic project in the aftermath of the defeat of Nazism of creating a cradle-to-grave welfare state, which would never abandon its citizens to the kind of privation they suffered in the 1930s. I don't think anyone I've ever spoken to in the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom understands the depth of the sense of a deal being broken that ran through Scotland when Margaret Thatcher began to say that all of that was over and that that deal was no longer on, and that, you know, there was no such thing as society, and that people had better look out for themselves, because that was the deal that in the post-war environment was holding the union together, and she understood her own country so little that she didn't understand that that was the case, which is why within 20 years, 25 years of her election as Conservative leader, we had a parliament in Edinburgh, because the Scots have a kind of feeling about where you need to draw the line on this, and that was one of them. Now, as various people have already said, we're approaching the situation where the Scots have to draw another line. I think caution will prevail, given the awful international situation, unless the SNP can raise its game very considerably in the way that I've just suggested, by creating a really strong vision of a different kind of state for the 21st century that is really going to work and deliver the things that people want, particularly a small measure, not necessarily a lavish measure, but some measure of economic security and justice. Otherwise, I think caution will prevail, but I don't think that will be a good outcome. Because unless the union side of the argument undergo a sudden and amazing transformation so that they're able to actually offer a progressive prospect for the future, instead of a series of dire warnings about what would happen with Scottish independence, then we will wake up on the morning after a no vote in the independence referendum with people who have voted against their own self-determination effectively, which never feels good, and with a victorious party who have nothing to offer but the likelihood of continuing reactionary government in Westminster and weakness on the part of what used to be Britain's social democratic left. And it seems to me that that is not a good prospect for the Scottish people. What the SNP offer is debatable, it's weak compared with what it could be, and it's often just downright shallow. But sadly, I have to say, it is no worse than what's now currently on offer from the unionist camp. And I think the Scottish people are being quite seriously let down by political parties on both sides of this argument.
As many of you might know, Mr. Salmond, the charismatic Mr. Salmond, fancies himself as a horse tipster. And he likes always horses that come from behind. He doesn't like these horses that lead from the front and wait for other horses to take them in the final straight. So there's only another 2 years of this debate to go. I hope you're in this as a marathon rather than Usain Bolt. Can we please thank our panellists for being such good people. Thank you.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.